Pada tanggal 26 Desember tahun 2004, gempa bumi berkekuatan 9,1 dalam skala Richter melanda dasar Samudra Hindia di dekat pantai barat Sumatera, Indonesia, dan memacu tsunami besar yang menghancurkan masyarakat pesisir di 14 negara. Nah, salah satu wilayah yang paling terpukul adalah Provinsi Aceh, di mana seluruh kota tersapu dan hampir 170.000 jiwa melayang. Kekuatan dahsyat dari bencana tersebut tidak hanya menandai momen penting dalam sejarah bencana alam, tetapi juga menggarisbawahi kerentanan manusia terhadap ekstrimnya alam. Lalu pelajaran apa yang bisa kita petik untuk meningkatkan kesiapsiagaan bencana di masa mendatang? Insight akan membahasnya bersama saya, Desi Anwar.
Dua dekade setelah tsunami Samudra Hindia 2004 yang menewaskan lebih dari 230 jiwa di 14 negara, termasuk Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, dan Thailand, upaya mitigasi dan rekonstruksi terus menjadi fokus utama. Tragedi tsunami 2004 memicu refleksi global terhadap kesiapsiagaan bencana, memunculkan berbagai inovasi dalam sistem peringatan dini dan juga manajemen bencana. Indonesia yang menjadi negara dengan dampak terparah kehilangan lebih dari 166.000 jiwa di Provinsi Aceh. Namun, bantuan rekonstruksi telah membangun kembali wilayah ini, menjadikannya contoh sukses manajemen pasca bencana. Sistem peringatan dini, jalur evakuasi, serta penanaman mangrove untuk mitigasi dampak bencana kini diterapkan secara luas guna meningkatkan kesiapsiagaan demi melindungi jutaan jiwa dari potensi bencana di masa depan yang penuh ketidakpastian.
Dua dekade kemudian, tsunami 2004 tetap terukir dalam ingatan sebagai tragedi yang mendalam yang mengkatalisasi gerakan global menuju peningkatan manajemen bencana, kerjasama kemanusiaan, dan juga pembangunan ketahanan masyarakat. Nah, pelajaran apa yang bisa diambil dari bencana tsunami 2004? Bagaimana Indonesia dapat memperkuat komitmennya untuk membangun negara yang tangguh bencana, terlebih di tengah resiko baru dari perubahan iklim yang diperkirakan akan terus memburuk. Untuk membahasnya, saya sudah ditemani oleh Penasihat Senior Pemerintah Indonesia untuk Rekonstruksi Aceh, yang juga merupakan penulis dari buku Tsunami Chronicles, Adventures in Disaster Management, sebuah kajian tentang program pemulihan Aceh, Bill Nicol. Hello, Bill.
Hello, Desi.
Welcome to the show, and nice to have you with us. Now, Bill, you wrote this book. It's called Tsunami Chronicles, Adventures in Disaster Management. It's just quite a heavy tome here, but the tsunami 20 years ago is one of the largest natural disasters that this planet has seen in human memory, and it's also the beginning and the end of a lot of things in Indonesia. Just tell us a little bit, what's the background to this book, which is, you know, very, very thick and very interesting. I've read some of it. And also, what was your role at the time in the reconstruction of particularly the province of Aceh?
Well, those two questions roll into the one. So I, for better or worse, was Dr. Kuntoro Mangkusubroto's lead advisor for tsunami reconstruction. And of course, then the earthquake reconstruction in Nias, because the two were joined together. From my point of view, it was an accident, I suppose, waiting to happen. I came to Indonesia for 2 weeks to help out as a volunteer. I landed in Bappenas on behalf of AusAid. They just said, can you help out? And I said, sure. And in Bappenas, I did a few things that drew me to the attention of the World Bank, and the World Bank were orchestrating the international community in response to this, and they introduced me to this man, Guntura Mangkusubroto, and also Sudirman Said, who was sitting beside him. Now, I didn't know either of them at the time, and there were no introductions. I sat down and Guntura said to me, well, tell me about yourself now. My personality is not one that just responds quite that simply to a question. I like a little context, but I knew something was happening. We had let us call it a robust discussion. And unbeknownst to me, he was looking for people who could be included on his team. All right. This, you mentioned in the introduction, this was the biggest. This didn't just overwhelm Indonesia. This overwhelmed the international community. All right. AusAid, when they rang me, didn't have enough staff to do it. So even the international community who were willing to help sort of didn't have the resources. And it takes a long time to bring resources together. So you've already had the military operation, the biggest peacetime military operation, and we can talk about that later if you like, but that was an amazing accomplishment, not just by the international community, but by Indonesia itself. Everyone thinks that coordination is easy. I tell you now, it's the secret to success, and it's the hardest single job to do because it's a highly political job as well as a highly practical job. And you need a combination of these skills. And what I found in this gentleman sitting before me, Dr. Guntura Mangkusubroto, Pak Kun. Can I call him just Pak Kun?
We all knew him.
All right, so Pak Kun and I just hit it off. I liked him, he liked me, and he at one stage he stopped this process and just said, I've made a decision. Put his hands down on the table. Right, I'm waiting for it. And he said, I've decided that I will only accept the appointment to lead the reconstruction program if you join me. Otherwise, I'm going to turn the president down.
Oh, yeah. So this is how you became part of his team.
This is...
Were you the left brain or the right brain or the
whatever it was,
right hand or the left foot?
Well, I like to see myself as a left little toe.
We had this BRR, as we know, the Badan Rekonstruksi dan Rehabilitasi. This is the beginning of the reconstruction.
This is very early.
Very early
Guntura had obviously been approached by President Yudhoyono, but no decisions had been made. Even Pak Kun had not made a decision to accept the appointment.
Okay, now tell me a little bit about how you saw the initial response by the Indonesian government to, this devastating tragedy. More than 170,000 people died in, Aceh and all around, and all over the world is right.
And no one knows the numbers.
And no one knows the numbers. I was there.
All the records have been swept away.
I was there 3 days after the tsunami itself. It was like apocalyptic. Now, what did you see? And how were things going on?
I did not go to Aceh, all right? I stayed in Jakarta. I was encouraged to go to Aceh to have a look. Who needs to go? Look, I've been in management. I was a journalist to start with, and I shifted across to management. They're my two great loves of this world. I ended up developing some sort of natural skill in managing crises and things. Skills you don't know you have, but then clients see something in you, give you experiences, and essentially train you. So when I came here, I'd seen enough disasters to know that's a disaster. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And everyone gets very confused in these environments. You have to understand something about disasters, which is what makes them a disaster. It overwhelms. This can be for an individual. If you and I are suddenly confronted with this building falling down upon us and we don't know how to get out, that's a disaster. You put that and just scale it up to, say, 240,000 people. They're just numbers, aren't they? But imagine that magnified. Each individual is, every survivor, every person, they're all going through their own little disasters, and it's just magnified. What happens is people then overreact. If their brains go funny, they go, oh, and busyness takes over. Busyness. Now, the moment people get busy, they lose sight of strategy. So I looked around, I'm in Bappenas, and I'm seeing every government agency involved. Hundreds of people, meetings with 50, 60, 100 people in them. Some with very senior people, like Sri Mulyani, did a magnificent job, by the way, inside Bappenas. Saw it firsthand. She was ace. Very good. And, but what I saw was people writing lists. Lists of buildings knocked down, lists of people killed, lists of bridges gone, lists of schools. That's gone. We need those. But a list is not a strategy. It's the reverse. And one of the difficulties that people have in making lists is they get caught then in the list. The list becomes the thing. So all these agencies were working hard, doing fabulous work, but writing lists. So when I looked at that, I knew within 24 hours this was not going to work. I asked, who's doing the big one? Oh no, this was it. So I just grabbed a few people. We took them away to a hotel room, and I sat down and I wrote, if you like, the strategy for the reconstruction program. That's all. Now that means you just need quiet.
Okay. So a list is not a strategy.
That's right.
Okay, meetings are not strategy. Nope. Okay, what are the best strategies? Let's take a little break here. Okay, because we've still got a long time for this conversation, and we really want to learn, you know, what happened, so that we know how we can respond in the future if, and you know, knock on wood, that a disaster like this were to strike again. So let's have a little break. Tetaplah bersama Insight with Desi Anwar. Kami akan segera kembali. Anda masih bersama Insight with Desi Anwar. Saya ditemani Bill Nicol yang merupakan penulis dari Tsunami Chronicle, sebuah kajian tentang program pemulihan Aceh. Kita membahas pentingnya pelajaran tragedi tsunami 2004 dalam bentuk kesiapsiagaan kita terhadap bencana. Dan Bill merupakan ya salah satu ya otak dari Badan Rekonstruksi dan Rehabilitasi Aceh, dan tentu saja perspektifnya mengenai apa yang terjadi 20 tahun yang lalu itu sangat penting. Now, Bill, a list is not strategy. So many things that need to be, you know, human lives were lost. The whole, you know, province is devastated, and you know, it's basically a world turned upside down, including the local government. This is where the role of the central government is so important. The role of coordination is so important, and also the role of the international communities that come to help is very important. What were some of the strategies, and how were they implemented, and what were the direct impact to the...
You've absolutely put your finger on the right question with that. A list is not a strategy. You're absolutely right. So many people miss this. If you read the management literature, what it actually, most generally, I've not found any that don't say this, is you develop the strategy first, and then you develop the business model out of it. It will drop out of it. This is back to front. A strategy is noise. Bappenas was noise. If I can use that, it's a metaphor for saying there's so much busyness around that there's no clear thinking. All good people, all with their heart in the right place, but they needed to take pause. So I walk in, I'm a simple soul. I can't cope with complexity. My brain is geared to simplicity. So here's where it becomes so fundamental to everyone. They need to think about this. You develop the business model, and the business model then supports the strategy. The strategy's job is to drive the business model forward. So, what is a business model? Really, very simple. It's just the building blocks of what goes together. It didn't take much to say, well, this is so big, it's going to need a dedicated government agency. It could be Bappenas, it could be the housing, it doesn't matter. They are going to have a dedicated agency. I didn't recommend BRR, but it had to be a dedicated agency with resources and power to be able to oversee it on behalf of a sovereign state, Indonesia. So there's the start of a business model, right? You don't need to know anything else. Another thing that I recommended, which they rejected, by the way, here we are, and that is, I recommended that you get that and then you have a one-line appropriation established to it. And what that means is, essentially, that agency can now decide what the priorities are and how to spend the money. You can give them the lists, but give them that flexibility. They rejected that, but here's the key. Here's the key. Once the idea of getting the model is right, everyone can fill in the detail around it. And then you get the purview, the emergency legislation, the detail of it, everything starts flowing together with a lot of very good people in the President's office and Contoro's team working together to create that model. If you get the model right, everything will work.
Okay, now we've got the platform, so to speak, which is very important because then everything will be focused. Tell me a little bit about what goes on, who should be in charge or who should run and do what, and what are the priorities of this agency, and how does that tie in to the whole, reconstruction and rehabilitation business?
I think you've just asked about 20 questions in one. Okay, let me try and piece it together for you. So, the President gives his blessing to the creation of a dedicated agency. Pak Kun accepts the brief based on if you like, the model and the powers granted to him. Remember, he's now got a couple of $2 billion of his own money that's going to come down to him. He's got a ministerial position. He's got just about every power that you can ever imagine for someone. He's got the international community coming in as well. At this point, so he has essentially everything he needs except one thing. That's called time. Now, there's already tens of thousands of people working in Aceh. We didn't get there till April. Remember, we're now talking about three and a half months before we get there.
Tragedy.
So BRI has to catch up. It's a very important agency, but it's not in charge. All it's doing now is arriving, much to the relief of everyone, to start thinking about how do we do it. Now the work starts. But at least you've got the foundation. You've got the model, the minister, you have people like me, Pak Kun has his deputies, all assistant ministers, so very powerful, very influential, and you have the weight of the international community supporting you both morally and financially and technically as well, with their vast resources. Now, this is sort of, on the one hand, God's gift to Aceh, but when you get that much power and that much money, it comes with enormous dangers. Yeah,
well, there's a lot of moral hazards there.
A lot of moral hazards.
I think you mentioned a lot of that also in the book. But just looking back, I mean, this is 20 years, and I don't think we spend enough time sort of, learning the lessons and talking about the tsunami. I think it's 20 years on, it seems to have sort of, gone missing in our collective memory, which it shouldn't. So what would be the highlights? What can we learn from the whole, not only just the tragedy itself, but how we manage that disaster?
Well, let me step it down from the top. Indonesia should be proud of itself. All right? It proved what it could do in the worst circumstances for its citizens. The citizens should take from this a faith that government is there, equipped to help them in a really tough environment. It should take from this that the international community is also there to help, although there's a paradox there we can come to. But so if you look at that, a lot of people just say, oh, well, that was yesterday. The whole building blocks of Aceh are part of modern Indonesia. A lot of the innovations that happened there are now being carried forward into Indonesia. SBY said to Pak Kun, you reform Indonesia from Aceh and I'll reform Indonesia from Jakarta. This was, can you see how simple that is? That's a business model. Simple. There's your vision of two men coming together with multiple other players, but they've formed this view. So right from the start, you have now BRI as the test case. It did the building blocks for Indonesia, but it proved what Indonesia can do.
So looking back, hindsight is 2020 vision, 20 years on, how would you rate, from 0 to 10, our ability to overcome and to rise from the ashes, so to speak?
This is a vested interest now you're asking for. I give it a 10 out of 10.
10 out of 10.
When I wrote that book, I travelled after working in Aceh with Pak Kun, 4 years on the job. And that book came because Pak Kun said to me, about week 3, he was right into knowledge retention. He said, Bill, we've got to write the book on this. This is so important to Indonesia, to the world. We've got to do it.
So we did something right. In a world where things, in our journey as a democracy, we focus so much on the negativity. Would you say this is something that Indonesia should be very proud of in
I would use the word very, very.
Very, very proud.
This was world's best practice. I studied other disasters. This is the best.
Okay. On that note, let's take a little break, but we will pass on why it's the best and what can we learn and how we can actually replicate this in order to build a much better Indonesia. Jangan kemana-mana, Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali sesaat lagi. Anda masih bersama Insight with Desi Anwar, saya ditemani Bill Nicol, penulis dari Tsunami Chronicles. Ini sebuah kajian tentang program pemulihan Aceh. Sudah 20 tahun yang lalu ya, tragedi di Aceh terjadi. Apa-apa saja yang kita bisa pelajari, dan menurut Bill ternyata ini adalah waktu di mana Indonesia dan seluruh dunia berhasil untuk bangkit dan membangun ya setelah tragedi yang merupakan bencana terbesar yang kita bisa katakan ya dalam sejarah. Nah, Bill, the tsunami, it affected Indonesia, but it affected many other countries as well, and it's a testimony of not just Indonesia but the whole world getting together and trying to, it's a humanitarian response. Everybody wants to be part of just, helping, doing good, giving, donating, and, just showing the indomitable human spirit to rise from a disaster. And in the background, at the same time, in Aceh, as we all know, there was this, there was a military sort of occupied zone, so to speak. There was the GAM, the movement. We call the rebels, but then there's the freedom fighters, and there's this Aceh peace process going on. So what can we learn about just the whole of managing, on one hand, this humanitarian disaster, but at the same time, getting this chess pieces together? Because for a long time, even for us journalists, Aceh was very much a no-go area. How do you see that coming together?
Well, you're right. There were complexities within complexities. There was the insurgency with GAM. That had been going 30 years. I think my reading of that is everyone was looking for a way out but couldn't find it. Even Pak Kun's wife, Ibu Tuti, told me that November before the tsunami she was in Pidai. Mm-hmm. Now, here is a senior, but not a minister at this time, already going in, doing some work in schools. A lot of things were happening, as Indonesia does, below the surface. Here was a family committed, trying to find a way to find their own, give breathing space. There was a lot of goodwill towards Aceh in Jakarta. Everyone knew they were locked in this war. Everyone was looking for a way out. And let me sort of step back slightly to the big thing, because you ask, how did that happen? Or how did the solution come? It came because really good people with immense power and very good heads and bigger hearts decided they were going to take decisions even though they didn't have full authority to take them. And they stepped up. Mm-hmm. Endriatono Sutarto, head of the TNI, just said, all hostilities cease, we're all in this together, that's what we're going to do. There were no instructions on this, he just took the decision. Yusuf Kala, Vice President, vice president. His job was broadly the disaster reconstruction. And remember, you've got to feel for the president because he's doing his job out in Papua, 5,000 kilometres away. The vice president steps in. And he's immediately opening warehouses, distributing heating oil, rice, etc., handing out money. Just spend the money because you need to get the economy going so people can buy things. He's doing that. Then the president arrives, and because there's a protocol around this, the vice president has to withdraw, because in a disaster area, you can't have both in the same place, because there needs to be what we call redundancy. So the vice president withdraws, the president takes over. The president's there. He's now working with Sutarto. Now, these are people just simply making major decisions. The war is still officially ongoing, and they've just suspended it. Now, these things don't happen just because they happen. They happen because people have exercised their role as leaders. Now, leaders take risks. They step beyond. And my definition of leadership is simply the exercise of initiative, hopefully directed towards a positive outcome. These were national leaders who came together at the right time and worked together. Amazingly, this president, your president, had only been in office 67 days. He hadn't settled in. He was still learning the ropes. He may have been a former general, but to become president of this vast nation, I mean, it's an immensely big step, and he's already trying to solve problems in Papua, and now he's got to get to the other end, 5,000 kilometres away, and suddenly have his head in this and dealing with it, and dealing with the bodies, as you say. So he's got the trauma on him. And these people are making big decisions which are the future of Indonesia. Before Dr. Kuntoro gets there, this country was blessed with some remarkable people, all of whom deserve their own recognition individually and collectively. They worked brilliantly together.
Okay, and you gave Indonesia 10 out of 10 for disaster management, and this is an example of a best practice on how to do it on the international scale. But what didn't go well? I mean, there's bound to be, obviously, especially when international presence and international money is involved. So what did you see as potential pitfalls, and some of the pitfalls that they fell into, but how did they manage to sort of extricate themselves so that you gave this kind, you're giving this kind of grade, which I think is quite remarkable, considering that when it comes to international disaster responses, a lot of the money, there's so much goodwill, but then you don't know where it ends up.
Money disappears very fast.
Yes, money disappears, it gets corrupted, it gets lost, and so on and so forth.
And it also stops because the donors lose faith in the recipients and just say, no, so what starts off as 100% turns into 20% or smaller. So the program built the faith of the international community. Not only did they keep the funds up, towards the end they were bringing in money from other areas that are where it wasn't running so well, and the donors were saying, oh, we'll give it to you because you seem to be doing it so much better. So right at the end, when the money should have been running out, we were getting extra flexibility. It was amazing. But can I just give you one figure? Maybe two, but the second one's more controversial. What people don't realise is that 99% of the money came from the great democracies of the world, 1% from the autocracies. Indonesia is a democracy. Democracies help democracies. This should be really rammed into people, right? The world community, the democratic community of the world, threw its weight behind a fellow democracy in a time of need. And that is truly amazing. The second figure, which is more controversial, so I hesitate, and I don't mean in any way to upset people, but 98% of the money came from non-Islamic majority countries. Another telling factor. So what you see in these things is it's the the philosophical backgrounds and the democratic traditions, and one other thing, which is the wealth of these nations. You cannot help anyone without money. You'll see one of the chapters in there is called The Great Enabler. Money is a phenomenal one. But they also brought their political support. The World Bank was the key organiser in Jakarta. And when there were problems, they were amazing because they were marshalling political support to support both SBY and others in this to make sure that they knew they had backing from the international community. Now, so this was a massive team effort.
And the money was well spent, would you say?
The money was...
And correctly spent, and, you know,
the money was very well spent. Now, let's go to Pak Kun. Pak Kun is as honest as the day was long. I was with him almost every day. I was beside him. I even slept with him during one siege, rats running around the room. We were there. I saw him all the time. I got to know him extremely well. And I developed a real fondness for him. But we had very similar values. He hated corruption. I didn't like corruption either. It can ruin a country. And his spirit infused the whole program. So we set up the world's best practice anti-corruption systems. And for that, I think you have a colleague, or you know Kevin Evans. He was given the task of designing them for Pak Kun. They are stellar. And Kevin deserves his time in the sun, because that whole corruption mechanism came because Pak Kun said, you do it and you make sure it happens. And it did. We kept corruption away. Yes, it was there. You've got to fight it every day. And part of my job was to be a thug. Big stand-up arguments with people, you know, thumping tables, etc. Building this resilience into an organisation that then built resilience into the program and gave donors the faith that their money was not being wasted. It was very well directed. The whole system was just amazing.
Okay, resilience. I like that word. We need more resilience.
We sure do, all of us.
Okay, let's take another break, but we will continue after this. Bill, Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Masih bersama Insight with Desi Anwar, saya ditemani Bill Nicol, penulis dari Tsunami Chronicles, sebuah kajian tentang program pemulihan Aceh. Kita membahas bagaimana tragedi tsunami tahun 2004 mengkatalisasikan gerakan global menuju peningkatan manajemen bencana. And you mentioned that Indonesia's response, well, it's not just Indonesia, it's Indonesia and Indonesia's friends and all the countries around the world that, you know, came together and, you know, creating a textbook of best practices and disaster management. It's just 20 years on forward. Is this something that we in Indonesia and the Indonesian government, do we recognize that we actually do have this asset with us? And why do you say that it's an example of the best practice? And how does the world react to it?
People forget.
And do they still recognize that this is an example that should be...
Desi, this is one of the tragedies. You see it repeated again and again. We forget the things we do well, and we remember the things that are not well. It happens in the media, it happens in organisations, it happened within our own program. The Multi-Donor Fund forgot towards the end how well we'd done, because its own reporting was only reporting the problems in the program, not the successes. So their bias started shifting. Indonesia has forgotten all about it. They don't... I've spoken to a lot of people. Now, the key people inside BRR, within BRR itself, the Reconstruction Agency, they remember. But not all of them have really thought through how this has the building blocks of Indonesia. You need to be able to step back to do this. I wrote those books at Pak Kuntoro's insistence, not just at his request, and I can guarantee there are lots of things in there that he did not like. But once I'm tasked, as you know, I'm a former journalist who became a management
So he asked
consultant.
you to write
He didn't ask me to write that book. He asked me to write.
something.
He wanted the book written. He wanted to document why this was important.
And is this a document or is this something else? The document.
That's actually 6 books in one. All right, there's 6 books within that, and it's published within a single volume, which is why it's a doorstopper. It's really too big. I wrote 1 million words on it, and there's 500,000 in that.
But why? Why? I mean, why did you do this?
Well,
and who would you like to, you know, who's your audience for this?
One of my audiences was Dr. Kuntura Mangkusubroto. Why? I had the greatest admiration for the man. I mean, leading his programs isn't easy. He was a marvellous individual, all right? He is the spirit of integrity for Indonesia, and he should be held up as such. Yes, he's like you and me, makes lots of mistakes. We had enormous fights. The phrase I like using is, we thought together, we fought together. But it was contestability. It wasn't about a clash of individuals fighting against each other. We were looking for the best solutions all the way through. How do we get from here to there? And my job was to think ahead, because he was thinking in the moment. He had problems to fix now. I was helping him, a troubleshooter, but I was trying to think, what's the problem next? Where is that going? Where are we going to end up? How do we bring this together? So when he asked me to do the book, I did 2 jobs. I stayed as his senior advisor and worked every day, and every night I wrote notes on the day. The politics, the knives in the back, the contributions, how people helped, where they helped, which agency they were from, what the challenges they had. Every night, pages and pages of handwritten notes. And so I documented it, and it became very important to do so, because that's a contribution to knowledge, and that's what he wanted. If you look at what Pak Kun wanted, it wasn't just the book. He was building a knowledge base on what we did there. He got it. Before I did, he was building the Tsunami Museum. He's already funding and planning that. All the records that are part of the National Archives, he was already planning that, because he knew if he got that right, then all the land certificates that he was issuing, he didn't have the power, would end arguments afterwards, when, you know, after dust settles and people come in and try to grab their properties back that have been distributed. So he was already watching ahead even further than I was, seeing these things. And it was all knowledge, 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 knowledge. He was very, very keen to document this.
Do you see that knowledge being used now?
First of all, I write big books that no one wants to read. Nobody wants the truth, all right? People step away from the truth. They want to know everything that they did well, but don't want to know the things that didn't work. International community is the same. That's the first real-time study of internal management, particularly in a disaster area, that I've ever been able to find. It's there in glowing detail. So it's not a textbook on here are the ways, the steps of management, here's the qualities of a good leader, etc. This is how management really works. It's a political craft plus a technical craft. And so you asked me, why did I write it? I wrote it primarily for him. He asked me to. I took it on as a commitment, and I did that. But I think you're also leading to a question, and I know that you sort of hinted at it. How do I know this is best practice? Right? Because afterwards, in writing that book, I travelled the world to look at other disasters. And I was looking for disasters in an environment that was similar to our own here in Indonesia. Notice my word, our. I own it as much as every person on the program. And I landed in Haiti to have a look at what was happening there. That was the equivalent. Now, the Haiti earthquake had been a massive one, and it was a mess. I mean, talk about everything about it. There was no central coordination.
But why didn't they could have just, you know, copy-pasted what?
Well, I went there speaking to people, they weren't interested. And the reason they weren't interested is they were busy in the mess. Remember, busyness. Busyness lists are not strategy. A strategy is not the business model. You need to be able to step back and see the framework and how to put things together. When people get into these disasters, they get busy. And busyness is the enemy of effectiveness. So again, the genius of the Indonesian government was to actually create BRR, put in someone like Pak Kun. His genius was to get someone like me sitting beside him to get into intellectual fisticuffs.
But then why didn't the international community, especially the agencies under the UN, why did they not replicate the things that we did during the aftermath of the tsunami in subsequent disaster management?
At the macro level, they did. Let's step back to look at management versus the technical side of management. When we started, we didn't have a database. UNDP helped us build a database. Now, databases are now ubiquitous. Technology has fundamentally changed. A database is one of the most important things now. That's where you have your lists. That's when you can sort them. You can see priority areas. You can do an analysis of them in real time. With artificial intelligence, you can now do it even better to really drill down and find out where things are. So the world has moved on technologically. The early warning systems, the satellite systems, they're brilliant. They didn't exist. In Aceh, when we were working, we hardly had a telecommunications system. It had all collapsed. And so the things that you now take for granted didn't exist. But once you step into the world of management, you step into the world of politics.
Of people.
It's people. They all have their own preferences. Now, what happens within these areas? Let me come back to the multi-donor fund. Don't let me say it wasn't good. It was basically European money, and they wanted it, and it was good. It was a single fund into which Pak Kun put some money from Indonesia.
And we had a lot of money, and we had, what, $7 billion US?
It was $7 billion all up. I don't know, it was about 800 million or so. I'm not good remembering those figures. There were so many of them. Which ones do you pick? But so the multi-donor fund started out. It was chaired by Andrew Steer. Andrew, head of the World Bank for Indonesia. Andrew was your classic managerial cowboy. Fabulous. This is a disaster. Now what we need is genuine leadership, flexibility, adaptability. He organises people, the international community comes in. He picks Kuntoro. He knows that the president likes him. They're manipulating. They're finding people like me. Plug me in there. They're very adaptive and they're a fabulous team. Now time changes. Andrew retires. He's exhausted. Pak Kun survives to the end. He was exhausted too. We all were. But Andrew leaves. Jean Bredeget from the European Commission, he comes in. Personalities change everything. By this stage, then, they're starting to say, well, BRR's a bit, they need to be tamed. They're a bit out of control. They're too cowboyish. So they start introducing formalities into it.
Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy. Log frames was the classic one we had to deal with, and they even had the attitude that they were setting the standards for the reconstruction, not BRR. This happens again and again. Now, you ask me, if they wrote any official report, would they tell you where they failed? That's the book of failures that you're seeing there.
Okay. Let's take another break. We've got one more segment, but I do want to kind of look to the future. What can we do with all this, history and also the lessons learned, as well as, we've actually got the tools on how to cope with disasters, how to manage it. And I think this is important, that we not only do we learn our lessons, but also we can make sure that when something like this happens, we know exactly what to do. Okay. Jadi jangan kemana-mana dulu, Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Masih bersama Insight with Desi Anwar, ada Bill Nicol, penulis dari Tsunami Chronicles, sebuah kajian mengenai program pemulihan Aceh. Kita membahas bagaimana kekuatan dahsyat tsunami 2004 menandai momen penting dalam sejarah ketanggapan terhadap bencana alam. Natural disasters and not so natural disasters, we have plenty of them, not just here in Indonesia as part of the Ring of Fire, but globally. We have the threats of extreme weather due to climate change, global warming, threats of conflict, both regional and worldwide. And also we're here in the Ring of Fire, always waiting for the next big one. Lessons learned, what needs to be prepared, how to do it, and how to mitigate and also basically manage potential disasters so that we don't run around in a panic, but we can immediately get onto the case of dealing with it. How?
You've already done it. Indonesia doesn't know what it does. It's a fascinating country. I have had a love affair with it for 50 years. Accidental? I'm not an expert, by the way, in Indonesia. As you know, I don't speak the language. How could someone like myself continue to make these contributions? Well, because people are people. Now, what your question is really about is, has Indonesia actually progressed from Aceh? Well, okay, it's all very well. We've done it. Really, Indonesia, this is what happens. Within systems, people forget what they've done. And they don't see any need to say, hey, folks, look at this. And then if they do, people say, oh, that's just propaganda. We'll just dismiss it. So we live in this cycle of ignorance. It's not willful, it's not deliberate, it's just we're human beings, and this happens again and again. Now just imagine, Pak Kun, SBY. They've agreed to do this. You've got use of colour in there, because he still is the daily reference point for Pak Kun. You've got these people working together. You've got TNI in the background. Now, they're now a civil defence organisation. They're the biggest organisation that can handle a disaster. Out of Aceh, a whole range of things start happening. We had to develop a development model that could be rolled out. That development model was put in place by SBY. This takes time. You've got to get all the regulations, all the legislation through Parliament. Yep. Democracy is a messy thing. It goes in. So SBY is working on this. SBY also brings in Pak Kun in his second period to head up his performance unit. He embeds the man with the greatest knowledge right inside his office. You just think about this. It's vanished from sight. Nobody even knows it. So now they're working and building these databases that gives the president direct information on what is happening in every administration. So they're moving, all this is moving across there. As the development happens, and most of the development started really under Jokowi. That was his big thing was that, well, SBY had laid the foundations with all of this, as had Pak Kun working together. So all this is happening, which enabled then the next phase, which was the big infrastructure program that happened during his period of office. Now, in the meantime, TNI had recognised, oh, my goodness, if this happens, we're really not ready. This was a big one. We better get ready. So part of the infrastructure that was starting to happen was building and extending airports across Indonesia. Now, those airports are rather important because how do you get big bodies of people and equipment in fast? By air. So you need to have a good infrastructure program. Now, these airports have been built and extended throughout Indonesia. Now, TNI has the capacity as an internal first primary defence agency to get on and move people in very, very fast. So have these institutions learned? Absolutely they've learned. Now, there's a paradox here because you have to institutionalise knowledge, but then you also have to learn or unlearn how the institutions work because they then become bureaucratic. But bureaucracy has its role, but you also need leaders like Pak Kun that can break free from it. Now, the classic here is your disaster management agency. Now, very few people understand how well that has gone. It does simulations internally. It's practicing all the time. It's actually doing real-time simulations. And it's not just as a national agency, it's cut down. I've been researching them because I'm fascinated with the way these things happen. It's been working down in local government areas. Now, here we come to a really interesting figure. 20 years have passed. I was only talking to the mission director of USAID yesterday, fortuitously. Now, they are watching these things very carefully. International community, they're ready to support. Here's the interesting, they have a statistic on how much help they give to Indonesia in a disaster. Over 20 years, their graph has gone down to 0.
And that's a good thing?
That is an astounding thing. What does it tell you? That Indonesia has built the capacity to manage its own disasters. Now, I always get the names wrong. Remind me the recent one in West Java.
The Cianjur.
Cianjur. Now, that was a big one. Did it make the headlines as much? Mm-hmm. Now, we've had talking about 50,000 people have lost their homes. That's a lot of people. We're talking about 300 lives lost. We're talking about 1,000 people who have been injured. Bang. No international help required, because Indonesia, through the disaster agency, has built enough resilience and knowledge already into the communities that Indonesia was able to.
So we have learned our lessons.
You have institutionalised and learnt those lessons. Again, the question is, can that be sustained so it doesn't become bureaucratised, so that you have the flexibility
How
of
to
leadership?
do that? Because every 5 years we have a new election, new government. Maybe they want to, do things their own way. But do you see sort of like a recurring theme that should be maintained?
I see. Absolutely. Indonesia is in the ring of fire. It needs to maintain this knowledge. My greatest fear in Aceh wasn't just that we might fail. That was entirely possible. A really difficult thing. Civil war, settling that. Rebuilding, international community watching, the media. You make one mistake. Achenese having a siege. You'd have to be there to understand the difficulties. But it worked so well. And the core thing was it laid those foundations which are going on today. Now, how does a government sit back and say, well, look what we've done? It's very, very hard. And the problem with bureaucracies is that they don't give people permission to make mistakes. In a disaster, you have to have a lot of forgiveness. Now, the reason they don't is because they don't trust their own people. Corruption, whatever. So you need to build in multiple layers of redundancy into this. You need to have fight corruption. You need to promote leadership. You need to know how to link disasters with the military. You've got a Lieutenant General in charge of the disaster agency. Why is that good at this stage of its development? Because the military needs to talk to the military. If the military is the first responder. So it's just that a lot of good things are really working. But then, politics being politics.
Yep. Politics, which means that you can't see the wood for the trees, right? You're so engrossed with all the nitty-gritty of everyday life. Well, time's running out, but just summarize for me, what are the key ingredients to create a resilient nation that can actually manage our disasters, both great and small, with basically, effectively?
Could I therefore, answering that question, step back from politics to statecraft? Now, very few people understand statecraft. It's actually not taught in universities. It's an add-on somewhere in the curricula for political science. Statecraft proper statecraft rises above intersectional day-to-day politics. All right? It's another level up. This is what you need in a president. It's a very difficult job being a president and sitting up there at the top of government, because they have to see a bigger picture. Now, and I have to tread delicately here because I don't want to offend anyone, although it's often my job. So statecraft has two qualities to it. Defend the perimeter, keep it stable on the inside. Without stability on the inside, you have nothing.
just very quickly, before I let you go, it was a tragedy, what happened 20 years ago. But if you were to say the silver lining in the clouds for Indonesia and for the history of Indonesia, remember, this was sort of like a newly post the authoritarian when it happened. We're just transitioning from a new order government to a burgeoning democracy. What would you say were the blessings? And say if it didn't happen, the tragedy, whatever, you know, what difference would it have made to Indonesia's
What if it hadn't? If it hadn't happened?
If it hadn't happened, because we had, you know,
I think it'd be a different place. It was tested. The systems in it. You know, when we went to school, we had the lesson and then the test. In life, we adults first get tested, and then comes the lesson.
For the young people who were, you know, not millennials, Generation Z and Generation Alpha, who didn't have this collective memory, what would you say to them?
I would build it into the education curriculum. As one story, education has two roles. One is give them the technical knowledge together with the thinking skills to be able to do it. The other is to build a nation, a national ethos with stories. Knowledge has to be retained, and an ability to analyse mistakes has to be done as well. Yeah. So that you're building layers of history and layers of memory. Okay. It's a long-term project for every nation.
But important. We mustn't forget our history. And this is a pivotal moment in the history, not just, you know, for Indonesia, for the whole world. I mean,
this was nation building.
It's a nation-building story, but it's also a story for the whole world on how to manage, face, and overcome a huge disaster like this. Bill, thank you so much, and, you know, important book here.
Pleasure, Desi.
And thank you once again for your insight, and best wishes to you.
Thank you.
Ya, demikian Insight with Desi Anwar kali ini. Jangan lupa Anda juga dapat menyaksikan tayangan ini di cnnindonesia.com dan di YouTube CNN Indonesia Insight with Desi Anwar. Sampai jumpa, stay safe. Bye-bye.